the day they called me cruel. Christmas had always been my favorite day of the year. Even after everything that had happened, I still believed miracles could find their way home. That morning, I woke before the sun. I baked the cinnamon rolls my oldest grandson used to beg for every Christmas morning. I roasted the turkey exactly the way my youngest granddaughter loved it. I even made the sweet potato casserole that no one else in the family ever cared for because my middle grandson always asked for seconds. The table was set for 7, just like it had been before our family fell apart. I knew they probably were not coming. They had not spent Christmas with me in 12 years. Still, I laid out every plate, every glass, every folded napkin. Hope can survive much longer than pride. Just after noon, I heard a car stop outside. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. Then the front door opened. 3 familiar faces stood in my hallway. Older now, taller, strangers in so many ways. Yet I would have recognized them anywhere. My heart wanted to run toward them. My feet stayed exactly where they were. No one hugged me. No one wished me Merry Christmas. We sat down in silence. The sound of silverware against the plates was louder than anyone's voice. Then my oldest grandson looked at me. His expression was calm, almost rehearsed. "Grandma, you are the reason our family fell apart." The words settled over the room like heavy snow. No one told him to stop. His brother lowered his eyes. His sister stared at the tablecloth, as though they had all carried those words inside them for years. I could have answered him. I could have told them everything they had never been allowed to know. I could have defended myself for the first time in 12 long years. Instead, I stayed silent, just as I always had, because the truth was never mine alone to tell. Sometimes loving someone means protecting them from a burden they never asked to carry, even if they spend years believing you never loved them at all. My grandchildren thought I was a cruel woman. They thought I had destroyed their family. They believed that story for almost 12 years, and I let them. Not because it was true, but because breaking my silence would have destroyed the only parent they had left. If you are going to understand why I accepted their hatred without a single complaint, I need to take you back to the days when everyone believed we were the happiest family on our street, because that was where the truth really began. If you had driven past our house back then, you would have thought we were the kind of family people wished they had. The lawn was always trimmed. Fresh flowers sat beside the front porch every spring. Children's laughter drifted through the neighborhood almost every evening. People often told my son he had built a beautiful life. I believed it too. My name is Hannah. By then I had already been a widow for nearly 9 years. Losing my husband had taught me that life could change in a single phone call. It also taught me never to take ordinary days for granted. Maybe that is why I treasured every Sunday my family came over. Those Sundays became the center of my world. Michael would always arrive first. He had inherited his father's habit of being early for everything. Even as a little boy, he hated making people wait. He would carry dishes from the car before I even reached the front door. Then he would smile that quiet smile of his and ask if there was anything else that needed to be done. There usually was. There always is when family gathers. A few minutes later, Emily would step out with the children. She was beautiful in the effortless way some people are. Perfect hair, perfect clothes, perfect smile. Our neighbors adored her. So did most of our relatives. She knew exactly what to say to make people feel comfortable. The children would race past everyone before the car doors had fully closed. Jacob always wanted to show me whatever he had learned that week. Olivia loved helping me in the kitchen, even if she made twice as much mess as progress. Little Noah usually followed his older brother everywhere with those wide, curious eyes that reminded me so much of Michael when he was small. The house came alive the moment they walked inside. There is a sound that only happy children can make. It fills every empty corner without anyone noticing. Those afternoons felt endless. Board games covered the dining table. Cookie crumbs somehow found their way into every room. Someone was always laughing. Someone was always calling my name. Sometimes I would stand quietly in the kitchen, pretending to wash dishes just so I could listen. Those were the moments I thanked God for. After losing my husband, I had wondered if joy would ever feel natural again. My family gave me that answer. At least that is what I believed. Looking back now, I realize something important. The happiest-looking families often become the easiest ones to misunderstand, because we only see what happens when the front door is open. We almost never see what happens after it closes. There were little things I ignored because they seemed too small to matter. Emily corrected Michael more often than seemed necessary. Sometimes it was the way he folded napkins. Sometimes it was the shirt he chose to wear. Sometimes it was the way he told a story. She always smiled while doing it. Everyone else laughed. Michael usually laughed too. I told myself that was simply how married couples teased each other. What did I know? Every marriage has its own language. Then I noticed something else. Whenever Michael offered to help with the children, Emily found a reason to send him somewhere else. Take out the trash, wash the car, run to the grocery store, fix something in the garage. He never argued. He simply nodded and disappeared. When he returned, the smile was always back on his face. It looked real enough to fool everyone, even me, for a while. The first time doubt entered my heart was completely ordinary. Dinner had just ended. The grandchildren were chasing each other through the backyard. Emily had taken a phone call inside. Michael stayed behind to help me clear the table. As he reached for the serving bowl, his sleeve slipped back just enough for me to see it. A dark bruise circled his wrist. It was already beginning to fade into yellow around the edges. I looked at it for only a second. He noticed anyway. Without saying a word, he pulled his sleeve back down. Then he smiled. The same calm smile he had worn all afternoon. I wanted to ask what had happened. The words reached my lips, but they never came out. Something deep inside me whispered that I was about to hear an answer I was not prepared for. And for the first time in my life, I looked at my son and wondered if the person everyone believed was living a perfect life was quietly falling apart where no one could see. After that Sunday, I told myself I was imagining things. A bruise can come from 100 ordinary accidents. People bump into doors, they carry heavy boxes, they slip on wet pavement. A mother should never let fear invent stories where none exist. At least that is what I kept telling myself. But once you notice something, your heart refuses to forget it. Over the next few months, I began seeing little moments that never would have caught my attention before. Michael stopped staying after dinner. He always found a reason to leave early. Sometimes it was work, sometimes it was a meeting. Sometimes he simply looked at the clock and said, "They should get the children home." The excuses changed. The sadness in his eyes did not. He laughed less than he used to. His shoulders seemed heavier every time I saw him. Even the children noticed he was quieter. They would tug on his sleeve asking him to play. He always smiled and said maybe next time. There was always a next time. Until there wasn't. One rainy afternoon he called and asked if he could stop by. Just him. That alone told me something was wrong. Michael had never been the kind of man to visit without his family. When I opened the door, he looked exhausted. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix. The kind that settles deep inside a person's spirit. I made coffee. He barely touched it. For several minutes we sat without speaking. The rain tapped gently against the kitchen window. Finally he looked at me. "Mom, can I ask you something?" I told him he could ask me anything. He nodded, then lowered his eyes. "Do you ever wake up wishing the day would end before it even begins?" My heart broke before I understood why. I reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers felt cold. Michael had always been the strong one, the dependable one. Seeing him look so defeated frightened me more than I wanted to admit. He took a long breath. "Everyone thinks Emily and I have the perfect marriage." I let them believe it. It makes life easier. I asked him if they had been arguing. He gave a tired smile. "I wish it were only arguments. She stopped leaving marks a long time ago. She learned better ways. There are no bruises anyone can photograph now. No shouting when other people are around. No broken dishes. No holes punched into walls. Just words. Every single day. Words that slowly convince you that nothing you do is ever enough." He paused for a moment. "Sometimes she apologizes afterward. Sometimes she buys me a gift. Sometimes she acts as though nothing happened at all. Then it starts again." I listened without interrupting. "Some pain needs room before it needs answers." He told me she controlled every dollar they spent. She questioned every minute he stayed late at work. She checked his phone. She decided which friends he could see. Even family visits became something he had to explain. Little by little his world had become smaller, until he barely recognized himself. I asked him why he stayed. His answer came so quickly it sounded as though he had repeated it to himself 1,000 times. "Because of the children. I don't want them growing up in 2 homes. I don't want them choosing between their parents. Maybe things will get better. Maybe if I just keep trying." Hope can become a prison when you refuse to let it die. The afternoon grew darker. Neither of us noticed. Then Michael reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope. He looked at him for several seconds before placing it back where it had been. Not yet. He whispered those words more to himself than to me. I did not ask what was inside. Some secrets reveal themselves only when they are ready. As he stood to leave, he stopped beside the front door. "Mom, there is something I need you to promise me." I told him he did not have to ask for promises. He already had them. He shook his head. "No, this one matters if anything ever happens to me. Please don't let the children hate their mother, no matter what they hear, no matter what anyone says. Don't be the reason they lose both of their parents." I stared at him. I wanted to ask why he would even think such a thing. Instead, I searched his face for answers. All I found was fear. Not fear for himself. Fear for the 3 little lives sleeping under his roof every night. I finally nodded. "I promise." He wrapped his arms around me. He hugged me longer than he ever had as an adult. When he walked out the door, he turned back and smiled. It was the same gentle smile I had known since the day he learned to walk. I watched his car disappear down the street. Something inside me wanted to run after him, to tell him he did not have to carry everything alone, to tell him we would figure it out together. Instead, I stood in the doorway until the rain stopped, holding a promise I prayed I would never have to keep. People always say they remember where they were when their world changed. They are right. I remember every detail of that morning. The sky was clear. The birds had already started singing outside my bedroom window. I was watering the flowers my husband planted years before he passed away. My phone rang. It was a number I did not recognize. For a second, I almost ignored it. I wish I had. A calm voice introduced herself as a nurse. She asked if I was Michael's mother. The watering can slipped from my hand before she finished the next sentence. "Your son has been brought to the hospital. You need to come as soon as possible." I do not remember the drive. I only remember praying, "Please let him be alive. Please let me be late for nothing. Please let this be a mistake." Hospitals have a smell that never leaves your memory. The moment I walked through those doors, I knew. People do not avoid your eyes unless they are carrying news that cannot be undone. A doctor led me into a quiet room. He spoke gently. He explained everything. Most of his words disappeared before they reached me. There was only one sentence my heart could hear. "We did everything we could." Michael was gone. It felt impossible. He had been laughing with his children only a few days earlier. He had promised to visit again next Sunday. He still had birthdays to celebrate, stories to tell, dreams to finish. Parents are not supposed to outlive their children. There is no name for that kind of loss, because no language has ever found words large enough to hold it. I sat beside him for what felt like hours. His face looked peaceful, as though he had simply fallen asleep after another long day. I held his hand one last time. It was already growing cold. I whispered every word I had forgotten to say while there was still time. Then I remembered the promise, the one he made me give. The weight of it settled over me like stone. A few hours later, Emily arrived with the children. Jacob ran toward the room before anyone could stop him. He was old enough to understand that something terrible had happened, but still too young to believe terrible things could happen to his father. His cry echoed through the hallway. I still hear it sometimes. Olivia buried her face against her mother's coat. Little Noah kept asking when Daddy was coming home. No one answered him. There are questions that break your heart simply because they deserve an answer you cannot give. The funeral came only a few days later. The church overflowed with people, co-workers, neighbors, friends. Everyone spoke about what a wonderful husband and father Michael had been. They were right. He was. After the service, I walked toward my grandchildren. I wanted to hold them, to remind them they still had family. Before I could reach them, Emily stepped between us. Her voice was quiet enough that only those nearby could hear. "Please don't make this harder than it already is." I stopped, confused. "Harder for who?" She gathered the children close, then she looked down at them. "Your grandmother always wanted your father to leave us. She never believed we belonged together. If she had not kept interfering, maybe your father would still be here." For a moment, I could not breathe. The words were so unbelievable that my mind refused to accept them. Jacob slowly turned toward me. His eyes were filled with confusion. Olivia looked frightened. Noah hid behind his mother's leg. I opened my mouth. I wanted to deny every word. I wanted to tell them their father had loved them more than anything in this world. I wanted to tell them that the only thing he ever asked of me was to protect them. Then I heard Michael's voice inside my memory. Please don't let the children hate their mother, the promise. I had given him my word. And a promise made to the dead carries a different kind of weight. So I closed my mouth. I let the lie breathe. Emily led the children away without looking back. Jacob glanced over his shoulder only once. There was no love in his eyes that day, only doubt. That was the last time all 3 of my grandchildren stood close enough for me to touch them. None of us knew it then, but 12 years of silence had just begun. People imagine that losing someone happens all at once. It does not. Grief has a way of introducing itself over and over again. Sometimes it arrives on birthdays. Sometimes it waits for holidays. Sometimes it appears on an ordinary Tuesday when you pass a cereal your grandson used to eat. The funeral was not the end of losing Michael, it was only the beginning. The first Christmas without him felt wrong before the day even started. I still woke before sunrise. I still baked cinnamon rolls. I still roasted the turkey. Habit is stubborn. Love is even more stubborn. I wrapped 3 presents, 1 for Jacob, 1 for Olivia, 1 for Noah. Each package had a handwritten tag, "Love always, Grandma." I drove across town and left them on Emily's front porch. I never rang the bell. I simply placed the gifts beside the wreath and walked back to my car. As I reached the end of the street, I looked in my mirror. Emily opened the door. She stared at the presents for a moment. Then she carried them inside. That tiny moment became enough to keep hope alive for another year. The next Christmas, the gifts were still on the porch when I returned the following morning. The wrapping paper was soaked from the snow. I carried them home without opening the trunk. The year after that, they came back in the mail, returned to sender. No explanation, just 4 words stamped across the box. I placed those gifts in the attic. I could not throw them away. Love should never end up in the trash. Birthdays became quieter. I still bought cards. I still wrote little notes inside. I told them how proud I was. I wondered how tall they had become. I hoped school was treating them kindly. I reminded them that they were loved every single day. Most of those cards never left my desk. I knew where they would end up. Sometimes protecting your own heart means accepting where the mailbox leads. The neighborhood changed over the years. Families moved away. Children grew older. New houses filled empty lots. Even the maple tree in my front yard stretched higher than my roof. Time kept moving, whether my heart was ready or not. Every now and then I caught small glimpses of my grandchildren, not because they came looking for me, because life occasionally crossed our paths without asking permission. Once I saw Jacob helping an elderly man load groceries into his car. He reminded me so much of Michael that I had to sit down on a nearby bench before my legs gave out. Another time I watched Olivia perform with her high school choir. I sat in the very last row where no one would recognize me. Her voice carried through the auditorium with the same quiet strength her father once had. I applauded until my hands hurt. Then I slipped out before the lights came on. Years later, I saw Noah pumping gas at a station while laughing with friends. He had become taller than Michael ever was. For one impossible second, I almost walked over. I almost said his name. Instead, I smiled from inside my car. Then I drove away. Those little moments became my entire relationship with the children I loved most. Watching from a distance, leaving before they noticed, learning to celebrate their lives without being part of them. People often asked if I had grandchildren. I always smiled. Yes. 3 wonderful grandchildren. Do they visit often? Not as much as I would like. That answer became easier with practice. Some truths are too heavy to place into casual conversation. On the 12th anniversary of Michael's death, I visited the cemetery before sunrise. I brought fresh white lilies, his favorite. I sat beside the headstone longer than usual. I told him about Jacob becoming a man. I told him Olivia still loved music. I told him Noah had inherited his laugh. I spoke as though he had simply been away on a long trip. Before leaving, I rested my hand against the cold stone. I kept my promise. The words escaped before I realized I had spoken them aloud. For the first time in 12 years. I wondered if I had done the right thing. I had protected the children from losing both of their parents, but in doing so, had I also allowed them to lose me? The question followed me all the way home. I never imagined. The answer was already waiting, in a place neither Michael nor I could have predicted. You never expect a funeral to give something back. You only expect it to take. Almost 12 years had passed since we buried Michael. In all that time, I had learned how to carry silence without letting it show. People often mistook that for strength. It was not strength, it was practice. The funeral was for Arthur, Michael's oldest friend. The two of them had met in elementary school. They played baseball together, shared apartments after college, stood beside each other at their weddings. When Michael died, Arthur lost a brother in everything but blood. After that, he visited me every few months. Sometimes we talked about Michael, sometimes we talked about nothing at all. He understood that grief does not always need conversation. Sometimes it only needs company. When Arthur passed away after a long illness, his daughter called to tell me. She said her father would have wanted me there, so I went. The church looked painfully familiar. The same wooden pews, the same stained glass windows, the same quiet voices trying to make sense of another goodbye. It reminded me too much of the day we buried my son. I almost turned around before walking inside. But I knew Arthur would have scolded me for that. He never liked unfinished goodbyes. The service was simple: stories, prayers, soft music. People remembering a man who had spent his entire life making everyone else laugh. As I listened, I found myself smiling through tears. Arthur would have liked that. When the service ended, people gathered outside beneath a gray afternoon sky. Small groups formed across the church lawn. Some hugged, some cried, others simply stood together in silence. I kept to myself. That had become my habit over the years. Then I heard a familiar voice. "Mrs. Parker?" I turned and saw Daniel, another one of Michael's old friends. His hair had turned gray around the temples. The years had reached him too. He hugged me gently. We spoke about Arthur for a while, then naturally, the conversation drifted toward Michael. Daniel sighed. "I still think about him every week." "So do I." He looked down at the ground for a moment. Then he shook his head. "You know, I always wished the kids had learned what kind of man their father really was." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Before he could answer, someone called his name. He excused himself with an apology, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. A few minutes later, I noticed 3 people walking toward the church entrance: Jacob, Olivia, Noah. For a moment, I wondered if my eyes were playing tricks on me. They were adults now, confident, composed. So much of Michael lived inside each of their faces. They had come to pay their respects to Arthur. No one had told me they would be there. I stayed where I was. Old habits are difficult to break. Jacob noticed me first. Our eyes met across the courtyard. His expression remained polite, distant, like someone recognizing an old neighbor. "Not a grandmother," he gave a small nod. "Nothing more." I returned it. "Nothing more." Perhaps that should have been enough. Perhaps we both would have continued walking. But then Daniel returned. He smiled when he saw the 3 of them. "You must be Michael's children," Jacob nodded. Daniel's face softened. "Your father talked about you every chance he got. There was never a day he wasn't proud of you." The 3 of them smiled politely. Then Daniel laughed quietly. "He was always worried you kids would blame yourselves if anything ever happened to him." Jacob's smile disappeared. "What do you mean?" Daniel looked surprised. He glanced toward me, then back at them. "He never told you." Silence settled over the group. Daniel's expression slowly changed. It was the look of someone realizing he had stepped into a conversation that had been missing for years. He cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, maybe I shouldn't have said anything." Jacob took one step closer. "No, please, what did my father tell you?" Daniel hesitated. "Your dad used to say the only thing that kept him going was you 3. He worried constantly about what would happen if you ever grew up believing the wrong things. He said children deserve to love both of their parents." Even when life becomes complicated, I felt my heart stop. Those words, they were almost identical to the promise Michael had asked me to keep. Daniel frowned. "I always assumed you knew." Jacob looked at his brother, then at his sister. Neither of them spoke. For the first time since they were children, I saw uncertainty replace certainty in their eyes. Not anger, not forgiveness, only questions, real questions, the kind that refuse to disappear once they have been asked. Daniel apologized once more before quietly walking away. None of us tried to stop him. The 4 of us remained standing outside the church, only a few feet apart, separated by 12 years, and a truth that had just begun to crack. Jacob looked at me, not with hatred, not this time, with confusion, as though he were seeing me for the first time. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. without another word. The three of them walked toward the parking lot. I watched them leave, certain I would never hear from them again. I was wrong, because 3 nights later, someone knocked on my front door, and everything Michael had tried to protect finally began asking to be heard. 3 nights after Arthur's funeral, I was sitting in my living room with a book resting unopened in my lap. I had read the same page at least 6 times, not because the words were difficult, because my mind was somewhere else. I kept thinking about the look on Jacob's face outside the church. For the first time in 12 years, he had looked uncertain, not angry, not cold, just uncertain. Sometimes a single question is more powerful than 1,000 answers. A knock at the front door pulled me back to the room. It was already dark outside. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, Jacob was standing there, alone. His hands were buried in his coat pockets. His shoulders looked tense. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly asked, "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. "You never need permission to enter this house," he hesitated before walking inside. His eyes wandered slowly across the living room. Almost everything looked exactly as it had when he was a little boy. The old fireplace, the family photographs, the wooden clock that chimed every hour. Time had moved forward. The house had refused to follow. He noticed 3 framed school pictures sitting on the bookshelf. His own, Olivia's, Noah's. They had been taken more than a decade earlier. "You kept these, every single one." He said nothing. I offered him coffee. He declined. We sat across from each other, separated by a table that suddenly felt much too large. Finally he spoke. "The man at the funeral, Daniel, was he telling the truth?" I looked at him carefully. "Which part?" "That Dad was afraid we would believe the wrong things." I closed my eyes for a moment. "Yes." Jacob leaned forward. "Then why didn't you ever tell us?" The question carried 12 years of hurt. Not accusation, not yet, just hurt. I answered with the only truth I had, "Because I made your father a promise." He looked away. "Mom always said you were trying to turn Dad against us. She said you wanted him to leave. She said you blamed her for everything." I let the silence settle before speaking. "Do you believe that he took longer to answer than I expected?" "I don't know anymore. That was enough." Doubt had opened a door. Now truth needed to walk through it carefully. I stood and walked toward the hallway closet. There was a small wooden box on the highest shelf. Simple, unpainted, almost forgotten by anyone except me. I carried it back to the table. Michael gave me this the day we talked alone in my kitchen. He told me not to open it unless something happened to him, or unless the children were finally ready to hear his own voice. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside there were only a few things: 1 envelope, a small digital voice recorder, and a folded photograph. Nothing more. No stack of papers, no dramatic evidence. Just the things one father believed might someday help his children understand. Jacob stared at the box without touching it. He looked frightened, as though opening it would change his life forever. Maybe it would. I handed him the envelope. Across the front, in Michael's handwriting, were 6 simple words: "For my children, when the time is right." Jacob recognized the handwriting immediately. His eyes filled before he had even unfolded the letter. He whispered, "That's Dad's writing." I nodded. He opened the envelope carefully. The paper had yellowed with age, but the ink remained as clear as the day it was written. He began reading silently. I watched his face instead of the words. At first there was confusion, then disbelief, then sadness so deep it seemed to steal the air from the room. Halfway through, his hand started shaking. He lowered the letter. "I can't," his voice broke. "I can't finish it." I reached for the paper. "Would you like me to read it?" After a long moment, he nodded. I unfolded the letter completely. My son had always written exactly the way he spoke, quietly, honestly, without trying to sound important. The first line alone was enough to stop my heart. "If you are reading this, then life did not give me the chance to explain these things myself." I continued reading. Michael wrote that he loved his children more than anything he had ever known. He wrote that adults sometimes carry burdens children should never have to carry. He begged them not to hate either parent. Not because everyone had done the right thing, but because hatred has a way of surviving long after the people who created it are gone. Then came the sentence that neither of us was prepared for: "If there is one person you should never blame, It is your grandmother. She has loved you every day of your lives, including the days you believed she did not. Jacob covered his face with both hands. The room became painfully quiet. After several minutes, he looked toward the voice recorder. Did he leave something on that too? I nodded. I had never listened to it. It belonged to all of you, not to me. Jacob picked it up carefully, almost reverently. He pressed the button. For a second, there was only static. Then a familiar voice filled the room, older than the one living in our memories, yet unmistakably Michael. Hello, kids, if you're hearing this. Then I guess life surprised all of us. Jacob froze. Every muscle in his body seemed to stop moving. It had been 12 years. 12 years since he had heard his father's voice. One tear slipped down his cheek before he even realized he was crying. The recording continued, slow, gentle, exactly the way Michael had always spoken. And with every word, the story they had believed since childhood began quietly falling apart. I did not sleep that night after Jacob left. The house felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just different. For the first time in 12 years, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt as though it was waiting. The next afternoon, my phone rang. I recognized the number immediately. It belonged to Jacob. His voice was quiet. Would it be all right if we came over? I had imagined this moment more times than I could count. Sometimes they forgave me, sometimes they walked away again. Reality was never as simple as imagination. I told him they never had to ask. An hour later, another car stopped in front of the house. Jacob stepped out first, then Olivia, then Noah. Seeing the three of them standing together on my porch again made time disappear. For a heartbeat, they were children. Then reality returned. They were adults now, people shaped by 12 years without me. None of us moved at first. Finally, Olivia spoke. You kept the porch light on all these years, I smiled. I always hoped one day you would need to find your way home, no one answered. But none of them looked away. We sat around the same dining table where we had once played board games and laughed until late in the evening. Now the only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Jacob placed Michael's letter on the table. The edges were already worn from being read over and over. We finished listening to Dad's recording, he said quietly. Every word. No one spoke after that. Sometimes the deepest truths need silence before they can breathe. Olivia finally looked at me. Her eyes were red from crying. Why didn't you tell us we were old enough? Even years ago you could have told us. I folded my hands together. Because your father did not ask me to prove I was innocent. He asked me to protect you. Noah frowned. Protect us from what? From having to choose. Children should never carry that burden. You loved your mother. You loved your father. If I had fought back every birthday, every Christmas, every school play would have become another battle. You would have spent your childhood wondering who was lying. Your father wanted something better than that. Jacob shook his head slowly. But we hated you. I know you thought we never cared. I knew you cared. People do not feel betrayed by strangers. Only by people they once loved. The room became quiet again. Olivia wiped another tear from her cheek. Mom always said you blamed her for everything. I never blamed her in front of you, not once. Even after all these years, I still will not. Your mother made choices, so did your father. So did I. Mine was to keep a promise. Noah leaned forward. Didn't you ever want to tell us every single day? I answered before he finished asking. Every birthday, every Christmas, every graduation. Every time I saw one of you from across a parking lot or sitting in a restaurant or walking down the street, I wanted to run to you. I wanted to tell you how proud your father would have been. I wanted to explain everything. Instead, I waved only in my heart. Because breaking a promise after someone dies does not hurt them. It changes the person who survives. Jacob looked down at the table. His shoulders began to shake. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I called you cruel, you did. I believed you never loved us, I know. You still sent birthday cards every year. I smiled softly. Did you think grandmothers stopped loving because they stopped being invited? Olivia covered her mouth. Noah looked toward the hallway, almost afraid to ask, did you really keep all our pictures? Without saying a word, I stood. I walked upstairs. A few moments later, I returned carrying 3 large photo albums. Their names were written across the covers. Jacob, Olivia, Noah. I placed them on the table. They opened them slowly. Every page held another piece of the years we had lost, school newspaper clippings, photographs friends had mailed me, programs from concerts, newspaper announcements, little notes written in my own handwriting. Jacob, age 14, looks just like his father. Olivia won first place in the choir. Michael would have been so proud. Noah got his driver's license today. Please keep him safe, Lord. Olivia stopped turning pages. When did you make all these every year? Even when I had nothing new, I wrote down everything I heard, everything I hoped, everything I prayed for. Because I was afraid one day my memory would fail before my love ever did. No one spoke. The clock continued ticking. The fireplace crackled softly. Jacob closed his album. Then he stood. For a second I thought he was leaving. Instead, he walked around the table. He knelt beside my chair and rested his forehead against my hands. "I'm so sorry, Grandma," the words came out broken. Almost like a child who had carried something too heavy for too long, I gently placed my hand on his head, just as I had when he was little. "There is nothing to forgive," he looked up at me. "How can you say that?" "Because your father never asked me to earn an apology. He asked me to love you. Those are not the same thing." Olivia came next. Then Noah, for the first time in 12 years. My 3 grandchildren were close enough for me to hold again. No grand speeches, no dramatic promises, just 4 people standing together, allowing 12 years of silence to finally come to an end. People like to believe every story ends with everything put back the way it was. Life has never worked that way. Some things can be repaired, some things can only be remembered. The weeks after that afternoon passed quietly. No one tried to force 12 years into 12 days. Healing does not move because we ask it to. It moves when hearts are finally ready. Jacob started visiting every Saturday morning. Sometimes he brought coffee. Sometimes he brought nothing at all. We would sit on the back porch watching the birds gather around the old oak tree. Most of the time we talked about ordinary things, work, weather. The baseball team he still insisted would have a better season next year. Then every now and then he would ask about his father. What was Dad like when he was my age? I would smile. Then another memory would come home. Olivia came on Wednesday evenings. She loved helping in the kitchen just as she had when she was a little girl. She still made twice as much mess as progress. Some things never change. She laughed the first time I told her that. It was the first time I had heard that laugh inside this house in more than a decade. Noah needed more time, not because he loved me less, because grief visits each heart differently. He came only once during the first month, then twice the next. He rarely spoke about the past. Instead, he fixed the loose porch step, repaired the old garden gate, changed the light bulb over the front door. Some people say I love you with words, others say it with their hands. Noah had always belonged to the second kind. One afternoon, Jacob asked a question I knew would come eventually. "Have you forgiven, Mom?" I looked out the kitchen window before answering. Forgiveness is a quiet thing. It is not pretending nothing happened. It is choosing not to spend the rest of your life carrying someone else's mistakes. He nodded slowly. Then asked another question. "Do you think Dad forgave her?" I smiled sadly. "Your father spent his whole life hoping people could become better than their worst days. I think that tells you everything you need to know." None of us spoke after that. The answer belonged to Michael, not to me. Spring slowly turned into summer. The flowers around the porch bloomed again. For the first time in years, the house sounded alive. Footsteps in the hallway, laughter from the kitchen, voices drifting in from the backyard. None of it erased the years we had lost. But it reminded me that love does not measure itself by time. It measures itself by its willingness to begin again. On Christmas morning, exactly 1 year after they had called me cruel, I awoke before sunrise. Old habits are difficult to break. I mixed the cinnamon rolls, placed the turkey in the oven, set the table, 7 places, just as I always had. Only this time, I did not have to imagine the sound of a car outside. I heard it, then another, then another. The front door opened before I could reach it. "Grandma, we brought dessert." Noah held 2 pies that looked as though they had survived a small disaster. Olivia carried fresh flowers. Jacob was already laughing at something no one else had heard. The house filled with voices again. Real voices, not memories. As we gathered around the table, Jacob quietly reached into his pocket. He placed a small photograph beside my plate. It was the last Christmas we had all spent together before Michael died. The edges were worn, the colors had faded, but every smile was still there. He looked at me. "You know, I used to think this picture was the happiest day our family ever had." He paused. "I don't think that anymore." I looked at him. "Why not?" Because happiness isn't a perfect moment. It's the people who keep loving each other after everything falls apart. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. No one rushed to speak. No one tried to fill the silence. Some silences no longer hurt. Some become proof that everyone finally understands. As I looked around the table, I thought about Michael. I wished he could see his children, not because they had finally learned the truth, but because they had learned something even more important. Love is not proven by the people who praise you. It is proven by the promises you keep when no one ever knows the cost. I never wanted my grandchildren to apologize. I never wanted them to feel guilty. I only wanted them to know one simple thing. Not for one Christmas. Not for one birthday. Not for one single day. Had I ever stopped loving them? And somehow, after all those years, that was enough. Sometimes the greatest act of love is never being understood, until the people you love are finally ready to see it. Some truths arrive too late. But love, when it is real, always finds its way home. Thank you for spending this evening with me at Lantern House. If this story touched you, stay a while. There are many more by the fire.